Have you ever had something happen in your life and you're like, God, why? Why? You called me to do this. I did everything you told me to do, but yet, what has happened? And so what do we do when we are faithful, doing what we are called to do, but life doesn't get easier, life gets harder? It would make sense in our world if good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, and the more faithful you were to God, the better life became, right? And the more unfaithful you were, that's when bad things would happen, and you could easily point to and say, see, straighten up. But that's not how it works, is it? I had a good friend of mine. He was a pastor, and so he was at a very nice church, but he felt God pressing on his heart a calling to start a church just south of Memphis in Mississippi. And so he was like, okay, God, if this is what you want me to do, make it happen. And so he approached the leadership, and they said, yes, go for it. He was all excited, something he had prayed for, wanted so desperately. God was calling him to do this. He stepped out on faith and started this church. And within no time, he had 50 people there. And it was on fire. He was great. But then 50 people turned into 40 people. And then 40 people turned into 20 people. And then after about a few years, the church was not growing, it was dying. Financially, it was devastated. And he was asked to leave. And he just couldn't understand. God, you called me to do this. I did everything you told me to do, but yet, what has happened? And he had a real struggle of faith with that. But that's how it often works, isn't it? The more faithful we are, the harder things get. And if you go through the Bible, you see this. Daniel was told not to pray, but he said, I will obey God and I will pray. And what was his reward? Thrown in the lion's den. Now we know the end. It was good. David showed mercy and grace to King Saul over and over again. And what was the result? King Saul kept trying to kill him over and over and over again. One of the hardest stories for me is Hagar and Sarah. Remember, Sarah couldn't have children, so she says, Hagar, my maidservant, she told her, you sleep with my husband and have a child. And then when Hagar listens to what Sarah says, Sarah gets mad at Hagar for doing what she said, treats her awfully, then kicks her out. And she's like, what did I do? I did everything I was supposed to do. And so what do we do when we are faithful, doing what we are called to do, but life doesn't get easier, life gets harder? What happens when that yoke that is supposed to be easy becomes a heavy burden and it's hard? You always like to read stories about the early church. And dear lights, in the early church, when people gave their life to Christ, life did not get easier. Life got hard. Life got difficult. In fact, it cost them sometimes everything in their life. And I would say that most of the world today, when a person chooses to follow Christ, life does not become this big bowl of cherries. Instead, you risk losing your faith, your family, your friends, your job, everything. So the more faithful you become, the harder life is. But we got to stay in the game. When we left Moses last week, he is a reluctant prophet for God. Remember, God calls him, and Moses has a million reasons why God's got the wrong person. But God finally gets Moses and said, Moses, listen, you're going. And Moses says, okay, God, I will go. He heads back to Egypt, and he meets with everybody. And when it starts off, it's great. Everybody's enthusiastic. He meets with Aaron, then he meets with the leaders, and look what happens. In Exodus 4, verse 29, Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. I love this because think about it. Moses was scared that the people wouldn't listen to him, but yet here they are, and they're having this great worship service. It's like if you had something you had to tell the church council and you were scared about it, and you went to church council and they had a big meeting, and all of a sudden a big worship service broke out, and everybody's falling on their knees and they're like, praise God, and you're like, yes, look what's going on. God, you are so good. You are so awesome. But Moses and Aaron had forgot that God had said, I would harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will not listen to you. But I think Moses, they forgot. I mean, when you're all caught up, everybody believes, everybody's excited, they're worshiping God, they forget that God said, nah, not everybody's going to be on your side. And I love this. And I'm not hating on Moses because I think we do the same too. Think about it. Jesus said, follow me. But he just didn't say follow me. He said, deny yourself. Take up your cross. Then follow me. Now we want to ignore those first two things. We just think that following him means everything's going to be great. I mean, think about this. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, his most famous sermon, begins with the things called the Beatitudes. And do y'all remember how the Beatitudes ends? In Matthew chapter 5, verse 10, he says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now think about it. That means that Jesus tells us up front, not everybody's going to be on your side. Not everybody's going to agree with you. And yet somehow as a church, we're still shocked when we go out there and say, there are people who don't want us to preach Christ. There are people who are opposed to us talking about morals and values and all these things. And we're shocked what Jesus says right here. Don't be surprised by this. And so Moses was told, when you go to talk to Pharaoh, I will harden his heart. But Moses did not expect it. But now, so when things go south, it should be expected. Look at verse 2 of chapter 5. After Moses says, let my people go, Pharaoh says, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. I love that he says, who is the Lord? And if I'm Moses, I'm like, who is the Lord? Yahweh, burning bush, God of creation. You know, so sometimes I forget that not everybody knows God like I know God. You ever do that? You're all excited about the power and the glory of God, and you try to tell somebody about that, and they're like, what? You're like, don't you know him? Look around you. He's everywhere. You can see his work everywhere. But Moses says this. God says, Yahweh. God, he says the name Yahweh. And he's like, who is Yahweh? I don't know him. Now remember, in Pharaoh's mind, Pharaoh sees himself as a god. And if Yahweh is a god, his people are slaves. And not just slaves, they're his slaves. So in Pharaoh's mind, Pharaoh is here, Yahweh is down here. And so he is saying, listen, not only is your God not really God, I don't know him, but your people, I'm their God. In fact, it's interesting here that the words that are used in this passage for work, for slave, for working, for servants, they all in the Hebrew have the same word or same root word for worship. And basically he's saying, these are my people. They serve me. Now again, Moses should expect this. God said it would happen. But I think what gets Moses here is not just that Pharaoh doesn't believe, but it's how diabolical he is. Because he just doesn't say, no, Moses, I'm not letting you go. He then goes after and discredits Moses and says, Moses, you're just a bunch of liars. You didn't really meet with God. You're full of baloney. And then he goes and makes life harder for the Hebrews. Look at verse 7. He says, you are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make them work harder for the men so that they keep working, and look what it says, and pay no attention to lies. Now think about how hard this was. This is like if you worked at McDonald's making hamburgers, and they came out and said, you have to go kill a cow and butcher it. We're not even going to give you the cow. You'd say, how in the world can I make the same number of hamburgers now as before? And so he said, they're just a bunch of lies. Now think about how hard that was for Moses. His faithfulness to God has now made life harder for everybody else. And look what happens here. That the people start to complain. It says in verse 20, when they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said, may the Lord look upon you and judge you. You have made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Now think about that. Go back to chapter 4. The people are so excited. God cares about us. God is concerned about our suffering. Go, Moses, speak to Pharaoh for us. And what has happened? Moses speaks to Pharaoh. Life is harder. That doesn't seem right, does it? That doesn't seem fair. And they go after Moses and they say, Moses, may God judge you for what you've done. And Moses is like, I'm doing what God said. I'm doing everything he told me to do. And imagine for Moses, it's like deja vu. He's like, oh my goodness, this is 40 years all over again. And I'm sure Moses is thinking, it was so much being in the desert shepherding sheep than dealing with all of this. Because instead of getting easier, life got harder. And it's so easy to get discouraged when results are not immediate. I mean, we want God to act on our behalf right now, right then, right there. We want instantaneous. We don't want to even entertain the thought that things get worse before they get better. It's kind of like if you go on a diet and you're on this diet and instead of losing weight for the first 2 months, you gain weight. How quick would you get rid of that diet? But what if your doctor said you gotta hold fast? After 2 months, it's going to start working, trust me. But do you trust the doctor enough? So these people, they were upset. And of course, who do they take it out on? Take it out on Moses. And where does Moses go? Who does Moses turn to? Who does Moses blame? The one who sent him. Look at verse 22. Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Oh Lord, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble upon this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." Do y'all hear the accusations Moses is making there? He's questioning God's goodness, he's questioning God's purpose, and he's questioning God's faithfulness. His goodness, his purpose, and his faithfulness. Have you ever done that? Have you ever had something happen in your life and you're like, God, why? Why? This was all your idea. Why? Why haven't you done what you said you would do? Why haven't you been good to me? And it's so easy to get discouraged and question God, question His plan for you. But that's where you have to remind yourself who God is and how faithful God always is.